Hey everyone, so today we're going to take a look at a really cool game that was played between Alireza Firouzja and Jan Nepo. Now both of these players don't need introductions, they are regular faces in the top 10 of chess. So this game was played on chess.com. It was a blitz game, but it was incredibly interesting, a very sharp battle between these two giants of chess. Let's have a look at the game. So Firouzja is playing with white, and he opens with e4, and Jan goes into his trusted Sicilian defense. We go into an open Sicilian, and Jan goes for his Najdorf defense. Firouzja opts for bishop g5, so going straight into the theoretical battle. e6, and f4, which is by far the most common try in these positions. We see knight d7, both players develop their queens to their natural squares, c7 for black and f3 for white. Firouzja castles queenside, and we see b5 here from Jan, so not wasting any time, launching his pawns up the board. So one of the big questions in this position is where will black's king end up going, as he can choose to go to the king side. It can potentially go queenside as well, which is quite trendy and topical in some of these knight off lines, or it can also hang around in the center of the board. And in this position, Alireza plays bishop to d3. Now if we go back to this previous position here, one of the other very theoretical tries for white in this position is, instead of playing bishop to d3, to go with the immediate e5. Now note that the queen is hitting the rook. We cannot simply take that pawn. This forces bishop to b7, protecting our rook, and also striking at the queen. The queen goes to h3. Now in this position here, notice that black has a lot of pressure on this central structure, but white has pressure on e6. So there is a very long theoretical line which goes something like this. Black takes on e5, but white sacks on a6, hitting the queen, forcing the recapture. White infiltrates, we see bishop to e7, and now white sacks another piece, bishop to b5, we recapture, the knight comes in as well, and there is all sorts of stuff happening here. So we won't go into too much detail on this line, as it wasn't the actual variation played in the game, but I thought I'd share that with people as it is a fairly interesting attempt from white. Okay, so let's go back to the position where Alireza played bishop to d3, and let's continue with the game. We see bishop to b7, Firouzja brings his rook to the e-file, lining it up against the king, and opens up a whole plethora of tactical possibilities with that move. And in this position, Jan castles queenside. If you are new to the Najdorf, this move might surprise you. Even if you play other lines of the Sicilian, it's quite rare to see the black king venture to the queen side like this, especially when we have a launch of our queenside pawns as well. Typically when we see the queenside pawns being thrown up the board, we typically see the black king sheltering in the middle of the board. But in these knight off lines, we actually see the king very frequently going queenside as well, and oftentimes it relocates itself to b8, making space for the rook to get back into its natural position. Firouzja plays a3, which is a fairly rare move in this position. Typically, white strikes immediately with f5, but a3 is a new try. And Jan moves his king out of dodge and looks to vacate that file for his rook. And Firouzja decides that now is the time to strike. He pushes forward with f5, e6, under a lot of pressure at this stage with the knight and the pawn. He can see that black is really starting to mobilize his pieces against the white king with a half-open file at his disposal as well. So white really needs to get something going in the center of the board. And as the infamous saying goes, the best way to counter a flank attack is to strike in the center. Alireza is looking to break apart this black central structure and crash through in the middle of the board, where he has a lot of firepower. Jan pushes his pawn forward to e5, which was forced. He could not allow that capture to take place. And Alireza sacks his knight on b5, a very thematic sacrifice in the Sicilian for white. Jan is forced to recapture, and Firouzja retakes with the knight. Now notice that there is two very big threats at this stage. We have the knight threatening the queen, and we also have a nasty little checkmate in one threat as well. So two very big threats with this knight infiltrating, but we have the calm queen to a5 by Jan, simultaneously protecting his queen and also guarding that mate in one threat. Firouzja drops his bishop back and hits the queen. The queen steps up, getting his king off that dangerous half-open file. And d5, Jan is playing this very thematically. Generally speaking, in the Sicilian defense, in many different variations of it, as black, when you have this structure with d6 and e5, if you have an opportunity to play d5, you generally play that move. If we go back to this position though, of course, d5 is the thematic break that most Sicilian players would play in a heartbeat, but actually in this position here, there was an absolutely crushing sequence, starting with knight to c5. Have a look at this. So holding back on our thematic d5 break for the time being, and jumping through with knight c5. This bishop here is really the glue to white's entire position. It protects the knight on b4, which would otherwise be loose due to the queen, and the bishop on d3 is also playing a key defensive role of c2 as well. Notice the rook and the queen are tickling that point. So there is a very nasty threat at the moment of simply wiping that bishop off the board, and white's entire position would fall apart. Okay, so let's say for example white tries queen to f1 with the idea that if we take that bishop, he simply replaces it with the queen, and the queen is performing the same duties. We simply take that bishop, and after white recaptures, we go bishop to a6. Have a look at that. The knight will be lost as it is pinned to the queen, and there is just way too much pressure here. Absolutely incredible sequence there, starting with knight to c5 in that position. Okay, but let's follow the game. Jan plays the immediate d5, very thematic strike in the center of the board. Knight to c3, so this was Firouzja's idea. He falls back to a defensive posture with his knight, striking the black queen and also putting pressure on the center as well. And rook takes c3. Jan sacks the exchange. I love the way that he is playing this game. It is so incredibly thematic. Everything that he's doing from the black side of the Sicilian is absolutely pure textbook. Have a look at this. Bishop takes c3. It's not even the typical dragon style rook sacrifice on c3 where you break apart the structure. White is able to retake immediately with the bishop, keeping the structure intact. So what was Jan's idea here? Why did he just give his rook away? He pushes forward with d4, so now we see the point, striking the bishop. Now in the actual game, Firouzja took that central pawn, but let's have a look and see what would happen if he tried to play greedily and simply dropped his bishop back. So why not just save that piece? Why not just drop back? It's our good old friend, knight to c5 once again. Similar ideas, but the main point here is that we've got a lot of pressure on the center here. We've got three pieces currently attacking that central pawn, and if that falls, white's entire center and position will collapse. So Firouzja took the pawn on d5 with his bishop. Jan recaptures. Now we see Firouzja's idea. He wanted to push forward himself with e5, striking the knight. Jan centralizes that knight and gets it out of harm's way. And we see Alireza continuing to push his pawns up the board. This is a really dangerous position here. In a blitz game, like how this game was played, I would be incredibly nervous here as black. Looking at these pawns storming down the board with open lines to the king, with centralized heavy pieces, I'd be absolutely terrified here as black. But let's see how Jan negotiates things. He takes the pawn and relocates his knight to f6, where it guards his other knight, and also keeps an eye on e4 as well, just in case the white bishop wants to activate itself there. Firouzja gives a check with his queen. Jan sidesteps, and we see that pawn crashing through now. So now we're starting to really understand the construction that Alireza had in mind when he sacrificed his bishop Jan has no choice but to take that pawn, and in this position here, there is only one move for white that keeps the game in balance, and Alireza, in a blitz game with about a minute 15 on his clock, finds the continuation. If you'd like to challenge yourself, pause the video here and see if you can spot the tactical sequence that Alireza found to keep the game in balance. Okay, so the move that he played was rook takes e7, sacrificing the exchange, but his idea is this. After black recaptures with his knight, the queen now infiltrates, and have a look at this. The queen is hitting absolutely everything in black's camp here. It's hitting the rook, it's hitting this knight, it's hitting this knight. What is this queen not hitting? From Jan's perspective, obviously he has to save that rook, right? He doesn't want to be losing that with check, so he needs to move it somewhere. Lining it up against the white king. Alireza starts scooping up, and now if we look at the position from a material perspective, it is actually equal material, but dynamically equal. So black has got 2 pieces and 2 pawns. White, on the other hand, has got 1 piece, but 5 pawns. White has got 3 pawns for the piece. Now let's see what ends up being more valuable here. Knight d5, hitting the queen and bringing the knight closer to the action as well. Firouzja moves his queen onto e5. Have a look at this. He plays knight to c3 check. Absolutely incredible. Forking the king and the rook and taking advantage of this incredible x-ray here. Firouzja couldn't just lose his rook. He had to take that knight. He had to open up the file and just pray that nothing nasty was going to happen there. Now, I think a lot of club players in this position here would see, oh, I've got a discovered check that I can play. I should move my bishop out to say something like f3 and pick up the rook. Now, it is really instructive to see how black actually handles this position. He doesn't cash in on that discovered check immediately. Instead, he scoops up the pawn on a3, locking the king in play, and now adding extra potency to the discovered check because the white king cannot run away. It is now in a prison. Now in this position here, I'm sure that if I were to give a lot of club players the white pieces here, I think that a lot of people might just straight out resign. But I love the way that Alireza put up a fight. Have a look at this. He takes the pawn on d4, and after bishop to c6 check, which is absolutely crushing, right? Like there is nothing for the king to do. We just need to start throwing away pieces. But have a look at this. Alireza sacks the queen for nothing other than the rook. And after Jan retakes, he picks up that pawn on h7. So from a purely material perspective, the game is actually completely equal. If anything, I think that a lot of club players with the black pieces in this situation would find it really difficult to convert this position and would actually be really terrified of their situation here. If white can just stabilize their position and start rolling forward with some of their pawns, this could get really terrifying as black. So I found it really instructive to see just how quickly Jan puts this game to rest. Let's play through these moves quickly and just see how things played out. Centralizes his bishop and some pretty nasty threats as well. Bringing his bishop back to defense. Now have a look at this. Look at this sequence here. Gives a check, discovered check, and picks up the pawn in the center of the board. And it is these types of positions that the queen absolutely dominates and shows her power. When you have an open king and you have weak pawns as well, this is when you see the full brute force of the queen. Let's have a look. Scooping up the pawn, taking advantage of the pin on the rook. There's not much that Alireza can do here, so he's just really shuffling his bishop around, but have a look at this final sequence from Jan. He creeps his queen forward, and the final blow here. And in this position, Alireza resigned. What an absolutely incredible game here from Firouzja and Jan. Completely thematic play from both sides. The way that they played that Sicilian defense was incredible.